He found a baby in the snow beside a woman's body, then heard her whisper, "Don't let them take her." The wind came down off the ridge like a blade, whistling sharp through the pine and scattering dry powder across the open stretch between the river and the cabin, where Tom Bridger first saw the shape. Half buried in the drift, still as death except for a faint flicker of movement at the center. He dismounted fast, boots sinking deep into the snow. And when he reached her, the sight made something inside his chest twist. A woman, pale and near frozen, one arm stretched over a bundle clutched tight to her chest. Her lips were blue, her dress torn, but the sound that escaped the folds of that blanket wasn't hers. It was a baby's cry, weak but real, the kind that grabs a man by the spine whether he's ready for it or not. Tom dropped to his knees, pulling back the corner of the blanket just enough to see the tiny red face, mouth opening in pain or hunger or both. The woman stirred, eyes fluttering, and for a second he thought she was already gone. But then she whispered, barely audible above the wind, "Don't let them take her." Her fingers clutched at his coat, eyes wild with something more than cold, something like fear tangled with pleading. Tom looked over his shoulder out across the snowfield, then back to her. "Who?" he asked, but her head fell limp again, breath shallow, still alive, but fading fast. He didn't have time for answers. He wrapped the baby tight in his coat, slid one arm under the woman, and lifted both in a single motion that made his knees burn from the weight and the slope. The mare whinnied and pawed the ground as he climbed back up, settling the woman sideways in the saddle. The baby held inside his coat, against his own heartbeat. The wind picked up as he turned the horse toward the cabin, and somewhere in the trees behind him he thought he heard hooves. Not many, maybe 2 or 3, just enough to mean trouble. He didn't look back again. The fire was still going in the hearth when he kicked the door open and laid them both on the blanket-covered cot by the stone wall. The baby let out one last soft cry, and the woman turned her head just enough to say again, quieter this time, "Don't let them take her." Then her eyes closed. Tom stared at her a moment, jaw tight, chest rising hard. He'd found 2 lives in the snow, and whether he wanted it or not, they were his problem now. By the time the fire had thawed the ice from her skin and the baby's cries softened into whimpers of exhaustion, Tom had wrapped the woman in every blanket he had, lined the cot with hay for extra warmth, and set the kettle to boil for clean water. He didn't know her name, didn't know who'd hurt her, but he could see the bruises now. Old and new, some around her wrists, a deeper one fading across her cheekbone like a memory someone tried to bury. She flinched when the wind whistled through the cracks in the wood, and her fingers twitched toward the baby even in sleep, a reflex that told him more than words could. The child stirred against Tom's chest, rooting slightly, so he dipped a clean cloth into the pot of goat's milk warming near the fire and let the tiny lips suckle from the edge. She took it greedily, fragile but strong, like something life refused to let go of just yet. "What kind of mess did you run from?" he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her, then stood and crossed the room. The woman's eyes blinked open again, not fully, not steadily, but enough to meet his in a moment that made the whole room feel still. "How long have you been running?" he asked low. Her lips moved, no sound at first, then barely above a whisper. 3 days. River led me. Lost the trail." Her gaze dropped to the baby. "She's hers, not mine." "Not really." Tom's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" But her eyes drifted shut again, and he didn't push. The wind rattled the window. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a clock started ticking, because whoever she ran from might still be close, and winter didn't stop bad men from finishing what they started. He stepped outside into the biting cold, scanning the tree line again. No movement, no smoke, just miles of white. But the tracks leading to the barn were wide, deep, and hadn't filled in yet. Someone else had been out there, and they hadn't come alone. When he came back inside, the woman's hand had found the baby again, and her voice, hoarse as cracked stone, said one thing before sleep took her again. Her name is Ruth. Tom looked down at them both, jaw clenched. He hadn't asked for this. But now that she'd said the name out loud, it wasn't just a baby anymore. It was someone. And someone was counting on him. The storm hit hard that night. Snow piling fast against the corners of the cabin, sealing them in with a silence so heavy even the fire crackled quieter, like it understood the weight of what had arrived. Tom kept the lamps low, every flicker of light feeling too loud for how fragile the woman and child looked, curled beneath his patched quilt. He sat at the table, sharpening his knife more out of habit than need, eyes drifting toward them every few minutes, always landing on the baby first, tiny hands twitching in dreams, breath shallow but steady. The woman hadn't stirred since naming her, but her color had returned, a faint blush under the bruises. He didn't know what to call her yet. Something about naming a woman felt bigger than naming a child. Maybe because names carried memory, and memory meant trouble. After a while, Ruth began to fuss again, her cries dry and high and thin. Tom tried the milk cloth again, warmed from the kettle, and rocked her in the crook of his arm as the way he remembered his sister used to with her boys. She settled eventually, cheek pressed to the worn fabric of his shirt, her breath brushing his collarbone like she already thought he belonged to her. The woman moaned in her sleep, shifting suddenly, and Tom moved fast to her side as her hand shot out, grasping air. "Ruth!" she gasped, eyes wide with fear before she focused on him. "She's safe," he said softly, crouching so they were eye to eye. "Right here." He turned slightly to show the child sleeping in his arms. The woman's whole body went slack, and she started to cry, not loud, not broken, just the kind of crying that came when a person had been holding their breath too long. Tom reached behind him, grabbed the chipped mug of water from the table, and held it to her lips. She drank a little. "They'll come," she said after a pause. "They always come." Tom didn't ask who, didn't need to. He could see it in her face, in the way her fingers kept twitching even while she lay still. After a long silence, he spoke again. "There's only one bed," he said. "You and the baby take it. I'll take the floor." She didn't answer, just nodded, like she wasn't used to being given choices. Tom stood and placed Ruth gently beside her, then laid a rifle within reach of the cot before stretching out on the floorboards. The fire burned low, the wind howled louder, and in the dark, Tom didn't sleep, not yet. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet when Tom eased open the door and stepped out into the bitter morning air. Boots crunching over fresh snow that had settled in soft waves across the yard. The wind had eased some, and the trees stood silent, like sentries waiting for something to come down the trail. He took a long look around before hauling a small bale of hay to the goat pen and checking the feed in the barn. Every chore he did with one ear turned toward the cabin, listening, not just for cries, but for trouble. When he returned, the fire was still burning low, and the woman had propped herself upright against the wall, one hand resting protectively across the baby's chest. She looked at him differently now, not grateful, not warm, but like someone finally beginning to believe they weren't about to be hurt. "She's hungry," she said simply as Tom came through the door. He nodded, already reaching for the small kettle he'd left warming on the stones. "So am I," she added, voice cracking from the effort. poured goat's milk into the mug, let it cool, then dipped the clean cloth into the warm edge and moved to kneel beside Ruth. "Her first," he said without thinking. The woman blinked, then watched silently as he fed the baby with practiced care, like this wasn't his first time. When Ruth finished, he tucked her gently against the woman's chest. "You held her like you knew what you were doing," she said softly. "Had a sister. Lost her to fever. I helped with her little ones for a while." She nodded. "Thank you." A pause. "Name's May." Tom looked at her. "That's your real name?" She hesitated. "It's the one I gave myself when I left the others behind." He didn't ask who the others were, not yet. Instead, he stood and handed her a hunk of bread and a strip of dried meat from the shelf. She ate slow, wincing between bites. "They'll be looking for me," she said after a moment. "They'll come for Ruth. They think she's valuable." "People like that," Tom muttered, "don't usually care about the child. They care about what she's worth to someone else." May flinched but nodded. There was gold. Her mother had it once, then fire, then men came. She stopped, breath catching, and turned her face to the fire. "I didn't steal her. I just couldn't leave her there." Tom stared at her for a long moment. "You didn't." And that was the only answer he gave before walking back outside, rifle slung over his shoulder. Because now he had a name, a truth, or at least a start, and a reason to keep watch. Tom was halfway through splitting logs behind the barn when the wind shifted and carried something sharp on it. Hoofbeats, faint but steady, echoing off the frozen slope like a warning whispered through the trees. He dropped the axe mid-swing and stepped onto the ridge behind the cabin, shielding his eyes. 4 riders. Black shapes against the pale horizon, too far to make out faces, but close enough that their presence churned his gut. No one rode this deep into the range unless they had reason. And nobody came quiet unless they meant trouble. He moved fast. Back inside the cabin, May sat upright with the baby still sleeping in her arms. She knew the look on his face before he spoke. "They found us?" He didn't answer. Just crossed the room and pulled the rifle from its spot by the door. "You said they'd come," he muttered. "Looks like you were right." She tightened her grip on Ruth. "What'll you do?" "I'll talk first," Tom said. "If they're smart, that'll be enough. And if they're not?" His jaw clenched. "Then we hope this place has enough wood for cover." He handed her a knife, small, sharp, familiar. "You ever use one?" She nodded once. "I've had to." "Then keep it close. And whatever happens, don't open that door unless it's my voice you hear." He stepped out before she could answer. The snow squeaked beneath his boots. He walked to the edge of the yard and waited, arms loose, rifle slung but ready. The riders slowed as they approached, hooves muffled by the snow. They looked like men who smiled only when lying. One of them, the tallest, had a red scarf and a long scar cutting through his beard. "Morning," the scarred one said. "Bit cold for company." "Don't recall inviting any?" Tom replied. The man's eyes flicked toward the cabin. "We're looking for a woman. Might have passed this way. Dark hair, carrying a child that don't belong to her." "Sounds like a lot of women in a lot of bad towns," Tom said evenly. "That's so." The scarred man smiled. "Mind if we warm up a spell?" "I do." Tom didn't raise the rifle, not yet, but he let his tone sharpen. "You want heat? Build a fire somewhere else." The silence stretched like a drawn bow. Then the man's smile faded. "This your land?" "Don't matter," Tom said. Right now it's mine to defend." The man didn't answer, just looked once more toward the cabin and spit in the snow. "We'll be back," he said. "Soon as it snows again. Tracks will be harder to follow." Tom didn't move, didn't blink. "Then I'll have the kettle ready." They turned and rode off slow, but not aimless. They knew now, and they'd return. Behind him, the door creaked open, and May stood in the shadow, Ruth held close. "They saw me, didn't they?" she asked. "They'll be back." Tom nodded once. "Then we start making ready. You and that child aren't going anywhere, and I'm not letting them come through that door alive." The storm came the next night, thick and blinding, as if the sky itself wanted to bury the truth beneath white silence. Snow hammered the cabin roof in waves, and Tom worked late by lantern light, reinforcing the shutters with spare planks, checking the rifle twice, loading cartridges in calm rhythm while May sat cross-legged on the floor, with Ruth swaddled in both blankets, humming a tune so soft it might have come from another life. By morning, the world outside had turned to bone-white stillness. No prints, no path, just the deep hush that came before trouble. Tom stepped out just once to check the barn. When he came back, his beard was crusted with frost and his boots soaked through. "Tracks are gone," he muttered. "They could be 20 feet away, and we wouldn't hear 'em till the door cracks." May tightened her arms around the child. "You don't have to stay," she whispered. "This isn't your fight." Tom turned, firelight flickering across his face. "It is now." He took his place beside the door, sat down with the rifle laid across his lap, and waited. Hours passed. The wind howled once, then stopped. Then came the sound, a single crunch outside. Then two, then nothing. Tom stood slowly. "Stay low," he murmured. May knelt near the hearth, clutching Ruth, barely breathing. The door didn't open right away, but the wood creaked, the latch twitched. A voice from outside. "We only want the child. That woman's got no right to her. Give her over and we'll go." Tom didn't move. "You show your face," he called, "or turn back into whatever snake pit you slithered from." Silence. Then the crack of gunfire. A bullet punched through the wall, inches from May's head. Tom fired back once, clean and quick, and the scream that followed meant one less rider. Snow scattered outside, movement blurred by wind and smoke. Tom stayed crouched, breathing hard, listening for the crunch of another boot, the slap of leather against saddle. More shots. One hit the doorframe, splintering the edge. Tom counted rounds, shifted left, and when the shadow moved again by the barn post, he fired clean through it. 2 down. The others retreated into the storm, hooves clattering in retreat. Then it was quiet again, just firelight and breath. May stared at him, eyes wide. "You could have let them take her," she whispered. "Would have made your life easier." Tom looked at the child, still asleep despite the noise. "I don't do easy," he said. "I do what's right." She started to speak, but her voice broke. She just nodded, pulling Ruth tighter to her chest. And in that moment, with powder smoke still clinging to the air and snow melting against the door, something shifted, not just between them, but in the walls, the floor, the very bones of the place. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a stand. That night, the storm softened, and the fire burned longer than usual, throwing golden arcs across the wooden walls, turning the cabin into a cradle of warmth that didn't match the danger that still hung heavy outside. Tom sat at the table, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes, while May cradled Ruth on the cot, whispering lullabies from another life. the kind that weren't meant to survive men with guns and winters that stole names. Ruth stirred once, then fell asleep again. Fingers curled like she was holding on to something invisible. "She ever have a real name?" Tom asked without looking up. May hesitated. She was just called the child where she came from. Nobody gave her one. I thought, if she lived, I'd wait until someone worthy did. Tom stopped sharpening, laid the blade down gently. "Then maybe it's time." May blinked at him, uncertain. "You think so?" She survived fire, a raid, a ride through the snow. She earned something to be called besides forgotten. May looked down at the child, brushing her thumb gently across her tiny brow. Then, Ruth stays. Strong and simple, like the first woman who protected her. Tom didn't say anything, but his nod was slow and sure. "And you?" he asked. "Is May the truth? Or just the name that kept you breathing?" She didn't answer right away. "My birth name was Ada, but I buried that girl a long time ago. May got Ruth out. May crawled through ash and snow. I think I'll keep her a little longer." Tom stood and walked to the hearth, tossing in another log. "Then May it is." A silence settled, not awkward, just full. Full of things not yet said and promises not yet formed. "You going to leave after this?" she asked suddenly, once they stopped coming. Tom didn't answer right away. He stared at the flame like it held a map. "I was never headed anywhere to begin with. Just drifted till something worth stopping for showed up." She studied him quietly, then stood and walked over. Ruth pressed against her chest. "And now?" He looked at her, not past her, not through her. At her. "Now I'm thinking maybe the drift's done." Outside, snow fell quiet again. Slower now. No hoofbeats, no threats. Just the heavy hush of winter making peace with what had happened here. And inside the cabin, 3 names now filled the space where silence used to live. By the time the snow began to melt along the southern ridge, Tom had patched every hole in the cabin, built a second pen for the goats, and carved a cradle by hand that now rocked gently beside the hearth. He hadn't said the words out loud, not to himself, not to May. But he'd stopped thinking of this as someone else's land. The fence was his now. The creek out back, the battered barn, even the pine stump by the fire pit where he sat each evening sharpening tools. It all belonged to a man who had chosen to stay. May never asked him why. She just handed him coffee each morning before the sun crested the ridge and moved about the cabin like it had always been hers. She still flinched sometimes when the wind howled or a door slammed too hard, but she no longer looked toward the road with that quiet fear in her eyes. And Ruth, now rosy-cheeked and growing stronger by the week, had taken to crawling after Tom's boots like he was gravity itself. One afternoon, Tom returned from chopping wood to find a stew simmering, May humming, and Ruth asleep under the kitchen table with a carved wooden horse tucked under her arm. "You made that?" May asked, nodding to the toy. "Had some scrap left from the cradle," he muttered. "Didn't mean for it to come out pretty." "It did," she said, and her voice made him look up. "So did this place. You made it better." Tom didn't know what to say. He took off his coat and hung it by the door, where it always stayed now. That evening, after dinner, they sat quietly by the fire. Ruth stirred once in her cradle, then slept again. May leaned her head back against the chair and glanced sideways. "You ever think of asking me to stay for good?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. Tom stared into the flames. "You're already here," he said. What I think about is building something that keeps you here because you want to be, not because you ran out of other places to go. May looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since that night, she'd collapsed in his barn, her eyes filled with something other than fear. "Then maybe you should ask anyway," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "May, will you?" But she was already beside him, hand over his, warm and steady. And for the first time in years, Tom didn't feel like a man on borrowed land. He felt rooted, chosen, home. Spring came slow to the valley, but it came sure, softening the hard edges of winter with meltwater trails and tiny green shoots pushing through soil that had once been frozen stone. The river ran clearer now, and the breeze carried birdsong again, not just silence. Tom walked the edge of the pasture every morning, boots sinking into wet earth, checking the fence line not just for breaks, but for signs of return. Hoofprints, cigarette ash, anything that might hint at unfinished business from the snowstorm months ago. May noticed the way his eyes always swept the horizon. She didn't ask, but she knew. One morning, after breakfast, she stood at the door with Ruth on her hip and said, "If they come back, we face it together." Tom looked up from the saddle he was oiling. "That's not your fight." "She's my child," May said calmly. "And you're not just a man who opened a barn door anymore. You're part of this. If they come, they'll be coming for all of us." That afternoon, Tom found the first track, faint but fresh, a horseshoe print too perfect to be old. 2 more by the northern ridge. He didn't speak of it that night, just sharpened the axe and reloaded the rifle. May watched him, her hands still as she folded laundry. "You saw something," she said softly. "Riders?" "Could be," Tom admitted. "Could just be wanderers." But both knew better. That night, they slept in shifts again, like they had during the blizzard, May on the cot with Ruth nestled close, Tom in the rocking chair by the door. The fire burned low, and outside, a breeze stirred the trees like it was whispering warnings. When dawn came, the sun lit the world in gold, but didn't bring safety. Hoofbeats echoed faintly from the east. Tom stood, rifle in hand. May wrapped Ruth tight, face pale but calm. As the dust rose beyond the tree line, one rider appeared, then another, 3, 4, not many, but not nothing. They halted 50 yards from the cabin. Tom stepped forward, boots heavy in the thawing earth. "You lost?" he called. The lead rider, a thin man with a blue bandana and a broken nose, leaned forward. "We came for the girl. Debt's still unpaid." Tom's voice didn't rise. "You're standing on land that's protected now. You step forward, you don't step back." The man laughed. "That barn rat? She ain't worth blood." Tom didn't move. "She's worth mine." Silence fell. One of the other riders shifted in his saddle. The man with the bandana stared long, then spat. "Ain't no coin in corpses. Come on, boys." The riders turned. And just like that, they vanished into the trees. When Tom turned back toward the cabin, May was waiting at the door, Ruth asleep on her shoulder. "You didn't fire a shot," she whispered. "Didn't have to," he said. "Not today." She reached for his hand. "And tomorrow?" "We build," he said simply. "We build like no one's ever coming again. But we'll be ready if they do." By early summer, the fields behind the cabin were thick with green, the fence mended in every direction, and a new cedar sign stood proudly over the front gate. Tom had carved it by hand. No flourish, no fancy paint, just deep, careful letters burned into smooth wood. Ruth's Rest. It wasn't a ranch yet, not by Montana standards. There weren't enough cattle, No hired hands, no brand on any herd. But to the 3 people living beneath the slanted roof of that timber house, it was more than enough. Ruth took her first steps in the front yard, wobbling barefoot through the grass, arms stretched wide like she was claiming the world. May watched from the porch, cheeks freckled and warm, shelling beans into a tin bowl, while Tom fixed the latch on the back gate again. "She's got your stubborn," May said over her shoulder. "She's got your steadiness," he replied. "It's a good mix." They smiled without looking at each other. That was how it was now. Soft, steady things. No need for big words or breaking silences. Just the rhythm of living where nothing had to be proved anymore. One evening, a traveling peddler came by, selling needles and dry goods. He saw the cradle, the garden beds, the child in the yard with dirt on her face and twigs in her braids. "Nice place," he said. "Yours?" Tom didn't hesitate. "Ours." The peddler nodded. "Funny name on that sign, Ruth's Rest. Thought this place might be a boarding house." May laughed gently. "It kind of is. 1 room, 3 hearts, and no vacancies." That night, when the lanterns were out and the stars pressed in close to the roof, Tom lay awake for a while, hand resting lightly on the edge of the cradle. Ruth stirred once and stilled. He reached for May's hand, found it already reaching for his. No words passed. They didn't need them anymore. The mountain no longer loomed with threat. The barn was no longer a place of collapse. The road no longer pointed toward escape. It all came back to here, to the night he found a starving mother hiding with a silent child, and refused to help her until she told the truth. And the truth she told had been enough to build a life. Not a perfect one, not a famous one, but a life worth staying for. A home carved into cedar,